Get on the ground before I make you regret standing there. Officer Mark Harlan's voice cracked across the downtown plaza, so sharply that conversations stopped mid-sentence and heads turned all at once toward the black woman standing beside a midnight-colored Cadillac Escalade parked near the curb outside City Hall. Naomi Bennett didn't move. She stood calm beneath the late afternoon sun, one hand resting near her leather portfolio, the other hanging loosely at her side, as four white police officers formed a tightening circle around her in the middle of the crowded sidewalk. People slowed down. Phones lifted. A little boy clutching a pretzel looked up at his mother and whispered, "Mom, what did she do?" The woman didn't answer. She just stared. Naomi's expression never changed, but her eyes sharpened slightly behind dark sunglasses as Officer Brett Collins stepped closer and glanced at the SUV. "That your vehicle?" he asked with a smirk that already assumed the answer. Naomi nodded once. "Registered and insured." Collins laughed under his breath. "Yeah? Funny how that works." The air around them shifted. You could feel it. The tension crawled across the plaza like static before a storm. Sergeant Daniel Rowe approached from behind the officers, tall, broad-shouldered, his badge catching the sunlight as he looked Naomi up and down with open suspicion. "We got a report of someone attempting to access a vehicle that doesn't belong to them," he said flatly. Naomi removed her sunglasses slowly. "Then whoever called it and made a mistake." Rowe tilted his head. "People like you always say that." A murmur rippled through the growing crowd. Near the courthouse steps, a young black woman wearing an intern badge froze in place while watching the scene unfold. Naomi reached calmly into her purse, but Officer Jason Pike immediately barked, "Hands where I can see them." Several people flinched at the sound of his voice. Naomi slowly raised her empty hands without argument. She had seen this before. At 26, security once followed her through a luxury jewelry store in Atlanta while another customer asked if she worked there. At 31, a hotel clerk demanded 3 forms of ID before allowing her into a conference she was speaking at. Different city. Same eyes. Same assumptions. And now here it was again, standing under the shadow of City Hall itself. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle," Rowe ordered. Naomi's voice stayed even. "I just left a meeting upstairs." "Sure you did," Collins interrupted. "Maybe with the cleaning crew." A few people in the crowd exchanged uncomfortable looks. One man quietly muttered, "That's messed up." Naomi looked directly at Collins. "You should be careful what you say in public." He smiled wider. "Or what? Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Naomi Bennett. Sergeant Rowe extended his hand. "ID now." Naomi handed him her driver's license without hesitation. He barely glanced at it before scoffing. "Naomi Bennett." He looked back at her SUV. "You expect us to believe this belongs to you?" Naomi met his stare without blinking. "I don't need you to believe it. I only need you to verify it." But verification wasn't what they came looking for. Not really. And deep down, everyone standing there could already feel it. Sergeant Daniel Rowe turned Naomi Bennett's driver's license over in his hand like he was searching for a flaw that justified the suspicion already written across his face. The downtown plaza had gone unusually quiet now, not silent, but charged, the kind of tension that makes strangers stop pretending not to notice. Cars rolled slowly past the curb. Phones remained raised. Somewhere behind the crowd, a busker stopped playing saxophone mid-song just to watch what happened next. Naomi stood perfectly still beside her Escalade, the black paint reflecting sunlight and flashing camera screens back into the street like warning signals nobody in uniform seemed willing to read. Officer Brett Collins circled toward the rear of the SUV and whistled under his breath. "This thing costs more than my house," he muttered loudly enough for nearby people to hear. Officer Jason Pike laughed. "Yeah, and somehow she just happens to be driving it downtown." Naomi's eyes shifted toward them, calm but colder now. "You could run the plates in under 30 seconds, she said. Collins smirked without looking up from the vehicle. "Or maybe we already know what we are dealing with." A man near the courthouse steps frowned at that sentence. A woman holding an iced coffee whispered, "Why are they talking to her like that?" Nobody answered because the truth already sat in the air between everyone there. Sergeant Rowe stepped closer until he stood directly in front of Naomi. "You said you came from a meeting?" Naomi nodded once. Fourth floor, East Conference Wing. Rowe glanced toward City Hall behind them and scoffed. Funny. Most people leaving meetings there wear suits. Naomi looked down briefly at her charcoal jacket, dark jeans, and low heels before meeting his eyes again. Most people in power do not need to advertise it. That answer hit harder than shouting would have. Officer Pike folded his arms. You hear that? She thinks she is important. A few uncomfortable chuckles came from the officers, but not from the crowd. Not anymore. Near the fountain, the young intern who had been watching finally stepped closer. Her ID badge swung nervously against her blazer as she spoke up. Excuse me, she said carefully. I think I saw her upstairs earlier. Rowe barely turned his head. Then keep walking. The young woman hesitated but did not move. Naomi noticed the fear in her eyes immediately. She had seen that look too. The look people get when they know something is wrong but are trying to decide whether courage is worth the cost. At 20 years old, Naomi once watched a black professor get stopped by campus security outside his own lecture hall because someone claimed he looked suspicious carrying expensive equipment. Nobody stepped in that day. Naomi remembered how quiet the hallway felt afterward. Silence had a sound, and she never forgot it. Back in the plaza, Collins suddenly held up Naomi's license between two fingers. Address checks out, he admitted reluctantly. Then his expression hardened again. Still does not explain why somebody reported possible vehicle theft. Naomi answered immediately. Because somebody saw a black woman standing beside a luxury vehicle and filled in the rest themselves. The sentence landed heavily. Even the officers stopped talking for half a second. Across the street, another phone lifted higher. A man in a gray business suit quietly began recording. Sergeant Rowe's jaw tightened. Watch your attitude. Naomi tilted her head slightly. You first. The crowd reacted with low murmurs as the balance in the plaza shifted almost invisibly. The officers still had authority. But Naomi Bennett had something more dangerous now. Witnesses. The crowd outside City Hall had grown thick enough now that traffic slowed along the curb as drivers leaned toward their windows, trying to understand why 4 police officers were surrounding a calm black woman beside a luxury SUV in broad daylight. The phones were no longer hidden either. People were openly recording. Some whispered. Others stared in silence. Naomi Bennett could feel the atmosphere changing by the second, but the officers either could not feel it or refused to. Sergeant Daniel Rowe handed her license back without apology. You still have not explained why someone called this in, he said. Naomi folded her arms slowly. Because assumptions travel faster than facts. Officer Brett Collins scoffed loudly. No, because somebody saw suspicious behavior. Naomi glanced at him. Standing beside my own car is suspicious now. Collins shrugged. Depends who is standing there. The sentence hit the plaza like cold rain. Several people reacted immediately. A woman near the fountain frowned openly, while another man lowered his phone for a second just to shake his head in disbelief. But Officer Jason Pike stepped closer instead of backing down. You are getting defensive, he said. That usually means people are hiding something. Naomi looked directly at him. Or it means people are tired. For the first time since the confrontation began, the young intern stepped forward again. Her voice trembled slightly, but she forced the words out anyway. Her name really was on the meeting list upstairs, she said. I work in administration. I saw it this morning. Sergeant Rowe turned sharply toward her. Did anybody ask for your opinion? The young woman flinched. Naomi immediately noticed it. Power always revealed itself in small moments first. In who interrupted. In who got dismissed. In who was expected to stay quiet. Naomi had spent 20 years sitting in boardrooms watching people mistake authority for intimidation. The difference mattered. And right now, these officers were proving they did not know it. Officer Collins suddenly pointed toward the escalate again. Open the vehicle. Naomi's expression hardened slightly. For what reason? Because I said so. That is not a reason. Collins took another step closer. You think you know the law? Naomi answered instantly. Better than you think. A few people in the crowd reacted with low murmurs again. The officers were losing control of the tone now, even if they had not realized it yet. The more Naomi stayed calm, the worse they looked. Sergeant Rowe adjusted the radio on his shoulder and lowered his voice. Listen carefully. We can either do this the easy way or the difficult way. Naomi almost smiled at that because she had heard versions of that sentence her entire life. At 28, a bank manager once threatened to freeze her company account because he did not believe she owned the business attached to it. 3 years later, she bought the building next door to that same bank and moved her headquarters there. People never expected memory to survive success, but it did. Every time. Back in the plaza, Officer Pike looked toward the gathering crowd and muttered, "This is turning into a circus." Naomi answered before anyone else could. "No, this is turning into accountability." The silence after that sentence stretched tight across the sidewalk. Then Collins reached toward the driver's side door handle. Naomi's voice cut through the air instantly. "Do not touch my vehicle." He stopped and looked back at her with open irritation. "Or what?" Naomi held his stare calmly. "Or the next 5 minutes are going to change all of your careers." Officer Brett Collins slowly pulled his hand away from the Escalade's door handle, but the irritation on his face only deepened as the crowd around them continued growing thicker by the minute. The plaza no longer felt like an ordinary sidewalk outside City Hall. It felt like a stage moments before something irreversible happened. Naomi Bennett stood in the center of it all without shifting her posture once. Calm, controlled, almost too calm for the officers surrounding her. That was what unsettled them most. People who panic are easier to manage. People who stay composed force everyone else to confront themselves. Sergeant Daniel Rowe folded his arms tightly across his chest. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," he said. Naomi answered immediately. "No, I am making it visible." Several phones tilted upward again. Across the street, a rideshare driver had stopped his car entirely just to watch through the open window. The young intern near the courthouse steps gathered enough courage to step closer once more. "Sir," she said carefully to Rowe. Her name really was in the executive conference schedule. "I printed the room packets myself this morning." Rowe looked at her like patience itself had become offensive. "And I told you already," he snapped. "This does not concern you." But the young woman did not back away this time. Her voice shook slightly, but she kept talking. "Actually, I think it does." The sentence hung in the air harder than anyone expected. Naomi glanced toward her and saw something changing in real time. Fear was still there, but now it was competing with conviction. Officer Jason Pike let out a frustrated laugh. "Great. Now everybody wants to be a lawyer." Naomi looked directly at him. "No. People are just tired of watching silence protect the wrong things." The crowd murmured louder after that. A middle-aged man near the fountain lowered his phone long enough to say, "She is right." Another woman nodded beside him. The balance was shifting again. Sergeant Rowe could feel it now too. His jaw tightened as he reached toward the radio clipped to his shoulder. "Last chance," he warned Naomi. "Either cooperate fully or we escalate this situation." Naomi's expression never changed. "You escalated at the moment you decided suspicion mattered more than verification." At 33, Naomi once sat through a private fundraising dinner where a hotel employee asked if she was there to collect empty glasses while white guests in cheaper suits walked past unquestioned. She remembered smiling politely while people avoided eye contact. She remembered the humiliation settling quietly into her chest like cold metal. But she also remembered something else. Every insult eventually became infrastructure. Every dismissal became leverage. Every closed door became a company she later acquired. And now, standing outside City Hall with 4 officers surrounding her, Naomi realized this moment felt exactly the same. Small minds wrapped in borrowed authority. Officer Collins suddenly pointed toward the intern. "What is your name?" The young woman hesitated. "Maya Brooks." Collins nodded slowly. "Maya, I suggest you stop interfering before you create problems for yourself." Naomi's eyes sharpened instantly at that sentence. Maya looked down briefly, visibly shaken, but then something unexpected happened. Another voice spoke up from the crowd. "She is not interfering," a man in a navy suit said firmly. "She is witnessing." Then another woman added, "All of us are." The sidewalk had changed now. This was no longer 4 officers controlling a scene. This was a crowd beginning to recognize a pattern. Sergeant Rowe glanced around at the raised phones, the recording screens, the growing whispers spreading through the plaza like sparks catching dry grass. Then he looked back at Naomi Bennett and said quietly, "You really think you are going to walk away from this?" Naomi met his stare without blinking. "No," she said softly. "I think all of you are about to walk straight into something you do not understand yet." The heat in the plaza felt heavier now, trapped between concrete buildings and the growing pressure of too many eyes watching the same moment unfold. Naomi Bennett stood at the center of it without raising her voice once, but the officers around her were beginning to lose theirs. Sergeant Daniel Rowe stepped closer again, frustration showing through the tightness in his face as more people gathered near the fountain and courthouse steps. "I am done playing games," he said sharply. "Place your hands behind your back." The crowd reacted instantly with overlapping murmurs. "For what?" someone shouted from behind a phone screen. Another voice followed. "She did not do anything." Naomi looked directly at Rowe. "You are making a public mistake." Rowe answered coldly, "No. I am handling a situation." Officer Jason Pike moved beside him, while Officer Brett Collins glanced toward the growing crowd with visible irritation. The control they thought they had over the scene was slipping inch by inch every time Naomi remained calm. Maya Brooks stood frozen a few feet away, clutching her City Hall badge tightly against her chest. "Sergeant," she said nervously, "please just verify who she is." Rowe did not even look at her this time. "Enough." Then came the sound that changed the entire temperature of the plaza. The metallic click of handcuffs opening. Several people gasped immediately. Naomi's eyes lowered briefly toward the cuffs in Officer Collins's hand before lifting calmly back to Rowe. "You are choosing optics over facts," she said quietly. Collins stepped forward. "Hands behind your back." Naomi did not resist. She slowly placed her portfolio on the hood of the Escalade and turned carefully as phones rose higher all around them. The metal closed around her wrists with a sharp click that echoed far louder than it should have in the open air. The crowd erupted into angry whispers. "This is insane." She has not even argued with them. They are doing this because she is black. One older white woman standing near the curb crossed her arms and muttered, "Maybe she should have just cooperated." Naomi heard it. So did Maya. The young intern looked stunned by the sentence, as if hearing someone excuse injustice in real time cracked something open inside her understanding of the world. Naomi stood there in handcuffs beneath the afternoon sun, posture still straight, expression still composed, but inside her mind another memory surfaced with painful clarity. She was 12 years old again, sitting in the waiting area of St. Agnes Hospital, while her mother, still wearing blue nursing scrubs, after a double shift, got stopped by security near the emergency entrance because someone assumed she did not belong in staff areas. Naomi remembered the exhaustion in her mother's eyes that night. Not anger. Exhaustion. The kind that comes from explaining your humanity over and over to people already committed to misunderstanding it. Back in the plaza, Sergeant Rowe adjusted his belt and looked toward the crowd as though trying to reclaim authority through posture alone. "Everybody step back," he ordered. But people were no longer stepping back. A man in a gray suit spoke up loudly. "What exactly are you arresting her for?" Collins answered before Rowe could. "Investigation." "That is not a charge," the man fired back. Naomi slowly turned her head towards Sergeant Rowe despite the cuffs around her wrists. Her voice stayed calm enough to cut through all the noise surrounding them. "Use your radio." Rowe frowned. "What?" Naomi met his eyes directly. "Call your precinct. Ask for Captain Rebecca Ellis." Collins laughed under his breath. "Calling somebody to save you." Naomi's expression never changed. "No," she said softly. "Calling somebody to save all of you from what happens next." The plaza outside City Hall had completely transformed now. What started as a routine afternoon downtown had turned into a living courtroom beneath the open sky, with dozens of strangers standing shoulder to shoulder, watching a black woman in handcuffs calmly face for increasingly uneasy police officers. Naomi Bennett stood beside her Escalade without struggling once, the silver cuffs around her wrists catching flashes of sunlight and phone cameras every few seconds. But somehow the officers looked far less composed than the woman they had detained. Sergeant Daniel Rowe stared at her after she mentioned Captain Rebecca Ellis, and for the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty flickered across his face. Only for a second. Then Officer Brett Collins scoffed loudly. "You expect us to believe you know the captain?" Naomi answered immediately. "I expect you to use your radio." Officer Jason Pike folded his arms tightly. "This is pathetic." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "No. What is pathetic is 4 officers standing in public pretending verification is harder than humiliation." Several people in the crowd reacted instantly. A woman near the curb muttered, "She is cooking them alive." Another man nodded while continuing to film. Maya Brooks stepped closer again, visibly nervous but refusing to disappear now that the moment had grown bigger than fear. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "you should probably make the call." Ro turned sharply toward her. "You need to stop talking." But Maya surprised even herself when she answered back. "No, you need to start listening." The silence after that sentence spread through the plaza like a held breath. Naomi watched Maya carefully. Courage always arrived awkwardly at first. Shaking hands, unsteady voices, fear wrapped around conviction. But once people crossed that invisible line between witnessing injustice and speaking against it, they rarely forgot the feeling afterward. Naomi knew that better than anyone. At 37, she once testified before a state oversight panel after a young black software engineer from her company was repeatedly stopped by building security inside an office complex his team designed. Naomi remembered lawmakers calling the incidents misunderstandings. She remembered how quickly powerful people hid behind language whenever accountability appeared at the door. But she also remembered something else. Systems never changed because the comfortable wanted them to. They changed because somebody finally forced the truth into public view. Back in the plaza, Sergeant Rowe grabbed the radio attached to his shoulder with visible irritation. "Dispatch," he said sharply. "Patch me through to Captain Ellis." Officer Collins rolled his eyes dramatically toward the crowd. "Here comes the performance." Naomi looked at him calmly. "No, here comes the verification you avoided." The crowd grew quieter now. Even traffic noise seemed farther away. Everyone was listening. The radio crackled softly against Rowe's shoulder for several long seconds before a woman's voice finally answered through static. "Captain Rebecca Ellis speaking." Rowe straightened slightly. "Captain, this is Sergeant Rowe, downtown outside City Hall. We have a detained female identifying herself as Naomi Bennett requesting direct contact." There was a brief pause on the line. Then the entire temperature of the plaza changed with one sentence. "You detained Naomi Bennett?" The confidence drained from Rowe's face instantly. Collins stopped smirking. Pike looked toward the radio. Around them, phones lifted even higher. Captain Ellis's voice returned, sharper now. "Why exactly is Naomi Bennett in handcuffs?" Nobody spoke. Not immediately. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly toward the cuffs around her wrists before looking directly at Sergeant Rowe again. Calm, controlled, unmoved. Then Captain Ellis spoke one final sentence through the radio that hit the officers harder than sirens ever could. "Sergeant, you need to uncuff her immediately before this department walks into a disaster it cannot survive." The plaza fell so quiet after Captain Rebecca Ellis's voice came through the radio that even the distant traffic sounded muted. Sergeant Daniel Rowe stood frozen for half a second with the radio still pressed near his shoulder, while dozens of strangers stared directly at him, waiting for what came next. Officer Brett Collins looked at Naomi Bennett differently now. Not respectfully yet, just uncertain. The arrogance that had carried him through the last 20 minutes suddenly had cracks in it. Captain Ellis spoke again, sharper this time. "Sergeant, answer me immediately. Why is Naomi Bennett in restraints?" Rowe cleared his throat. "Captain, we received a suspicious activity report involving a luxury vehicle outside City Hall." There was another pause. Then Captain Ellis answered with a tone that sounded dangerously controlled. "That luxury vehicle belongs to Naomi Bennett." The crowd reacted instantly with overlapping whispers. "I knew it. Oh my God. They really handcuffed her for standing by her own car." Phones tilted closer. The officers could feel the eyes on them now from every angle. Naomi remained perfectly still beside the escalate, her wrists still cuffed in front of her, posture unchanged, expression unreadable. Captain Ellis continued speaking through the radio. "Naomi Bennett is the Chief Executive Officer of Bennett Civic Systems. Her company oversees the civilian accountability audit your precinct has been under for the last 6 months." The color drained from Officer Jason Pike's face. Collins looked toward Rowe as if silently begging for a different explanation to exist. But there was none. Maya Brooks covered her mouth with one hand, stunned even though she already suspected Naomi was important. What she had not expected was this level of power. Sergeant Rowe finally spoke again, but his confidence had vanished. "Captain, we were only attempting to verify." Ellis cut him off immediately. "By handcuffing her in public before running her plates." Nobody in the plaza moved. Nobody even pretended not to listen anymore. Naomi slowly lifted her eyes toward Rowe as Captain Ellis continued. Do you understand who you detained? Rowe swallowed hard. Yes, Captain. No, Ellis snapped. You clearly do not. The silence afterward hit harder than shouting ever could. Naomi finally spoke then, her voice calm enough to slice straight through the tension surrounding them. You did not detain a threat today. Her eyes moved slowly across all four officers. You exposed a department. The sentence landed like a dropped weight in the center of the plaza. A man near the fountain lowered his phone briefly and whispered, "Damn." Another woman shook her head slowly in disbelief. Officer Collins stepped forward awkwardly with the handcuff key suddenly trembling slightly between his fingers. Naomi looked at him before he could speak. Do not rush now, she said quietly. You seemed very certain 5 minutes ago. Collins froze. The humiliation settling across the officers' faces was becoming impossible to hide. At 39, Naomi once sat through a city contract meeting where an executive interrupted her presentation 3 separate times to ask whether someone senior would be joining the discussion later. He learned halfway through the meeting that she owned the firm bidding on the contract. Naomi remembered how quickly confidence turned into apology once power became visible. But apologies never interested her as much as patterns did. And right now, standing handcuffed beneath the afternoon sun while half the city seemed to be recording, the pattern was clearer than ever. Captain Ellis returned on the radio one last time. Sergeant Rowe, Officer Collins, Officer Pike, and Officer Harlan are to report directly back to the precinct immediately after releasing Ms. Bennett. Internal review starts now. The crowd erupted into louder murmurs. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly toward the cuffs around her wrists before looking directly at Rowe again. You saw a black woman beside an expensive vehicle, she said softly, and you filled in the rest with your prejudice. Nobody argued with her this time, because now the whole plaza had heard the truth out loud. Officer Brett Collins finally stepped forward with the handcuff key in his trembling hand while the entire plaza watched in absolute silence. The confidence that once filled his posture was gone now, replaced by the stiff panic of someone realizing too late that public humiliation works both ways. Naomi Bennett stood perfectly still beside the escalate as the cuffs clicked open around her wrists. She did not rub her hands afterward. She did not yell. She did not demand apologies. That was what made the moment feel heavier than anger. Sergeant Daniel Rowe kept one hand near the radio on his shoulder, his jaw tight as Captain Rebecca Ellis continued issuing orders through the static. All 4 officers report directly to the precinct immediately, Ellis said sharply. And Sergeant, do not speak to Ms. Bennett again unless she addresses you first. Several people in the crowd reacted audibly to that sentence. Phones remained raised everywhere now. A man near the courthouse stairs whispered, "This is unbelievable." Maya Brooks stood frozen near the fountain, still trying to process how quickly the balance of power had reversed. Naomi slowly picked up her leather portfolio from the hood of the Escalade and looked toward the crowd surrounding the scene. For a brief second, dozens of strangers looked back at her not with pity, but with recognition. They had seen this pattern before too. Different city, different uniforms, same assumptions. Naomi glanced down at the faint red marks left on her wrists before turning calmly towards Sergeant Rowe. "I want to go to the precinct," she said. Rowe blinked in confusion. "What? You heard me." Naomi's voice stayed level. "I would like to continue this conversation where your entire department can hear it." Officer Jason Pike looked visibly uncomfortable now. "Captain Ellis already ordered us back." Naomi nodded once. "Good. Then we are going together." Nobody argued with her. They could not. The plaza had shifted too far. The crowd parted slowly as Naomi walked toward the black police SUV parked near the curb. Not escorted now. Followed. Witnessed. Even the officers seemed unsure where to stand around her anymore. Maya stepped closer as Naomi passed by. "Ms. Bennett," she said quietly, "I am sorry." Naomi stopped briefly and looked at the young intern. "You spoke up," she answered softly. "Most people do not." That sentence hit Maya harder than anything else that afternoon. Back at the precinct 20 minutes later, the atmosphere inside the building felt tense enough to crack glass. Officers behind the front desk stopped talking the moment Naomi Bennett walked through the doors beside Sergeant Rowe and the others. Some recognized her immediately. Others recognized the look on their co-workers' faces. Either way, silence spread through the station like smoke. Captain Rebecca Ellis emerged from the hallway near the operations room. her expression controlled but severe. She walked directly toward Naomi first. "Ms. Bennett," she said carefully, "on behalf of this department." Naomi raised one hand slightly. "Save the statement for after the review." Ellis nodded once. No defensiveness. No excuses. Just understanding. Around the precinct, officers pretended to work while secretly watching everything unfold. Naomi slowly turned her gaze across the room, taking in the uniforms, the radios, the glowing monitors, the body camera docking stations lined against the walls. At 35, Naomi helped design civilian oversight software after a teenager in Cleveland was wrongfully detained because officers ignored conflicting database information. She remembered sitting with the boy's mother afterward while she cried quietly into folded hospital paperwork. That memory lived in Naomi every time she entered a police building now. Systems failed people when pride mattered more than truth. Captain Ellis motioned toward the operations room. "The audit files are ready." Naomi looked back once toward Rowe, Collins, Pike, and Harlan standing stiffly near the front desk. "Good," she said calmly. "Then let us finally look at what your department does when it thinks nobody important is watching." The operations room inside the precinct felt colder than the plaza outside, but the tension was far heavier. Naomi Bennett stood at the center of the room while multiple monitors glowed across the walls showing dispatch feeds, body camera uploads, patrol logs, and disciplinary reports waiting behind locked databases. Officers moved carefully now, quieter than before, as if every footstep inside the building suddenly carried consequences. Captain Rebecca Ellis stood near the main console with both hands clasped tightly behind her back, while Sergeant Daniel Rowe and the three officers remained several feet away, stiff and silent beneath the fluorescent lights. Naomi slowly walked toward the central monitor station, her heels echoing softly against the polished floor. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody questioned her authority now. One of the technicians at the console glanced nervously toward Captain Ellis before opening the audit dashboard connected to Bennett Civic Systems. Rows of complaints immediately filled the screen. Use of force reviews, wrongful stop reports, bias complaints, dismissed incidents, closed investigations reopened under civilian review. The room grew even quieter. Naomi looked across the data without surprise. Only disappointment. "How many of these were ignored?" she asked calmly. No one answered immediately. Captain Ellis finally spoke. "Too many." Naomi nodded slowly. That is always the answer. At 40 years old, Naomi had spent nearly half her life building oversight systems because she understood something most people in power never admitted out loud. Institutions rarely collapse from one dramatic act. They collapse from small abuses repeated long enough to become culture. One ignored complaint becomes 10. 10 become policy. Policy becomes habit. And habit becomes somebody standing in handcuffs outside City Hall because 4 officers trusted their assumptions more than verification. Naomi turned towards Sergeant Rowe. "When you stopped me today, what exactly made me suspicious?" Rowe lowered his eyes briefly. "The report said someone was attempting unauthorized access to the vehicle." Naomi's voice stayed calm. "No. I asked what made me suspicious to you." The room fell still again. Officer Brett Collins looked down at the floor. Officer Jason Pike swallowed hard. Nobody wanted to answer because now the truth sounded uglier inside the precinct than it had outside. Naomi stepped closer to the center table and carefully removed the silver handcuffs from where they had been placed after her release. She held them quietly for a moment beneath the fluorescent lights before setting them down against the polished surface with a soft metallic click. Every officer in the room heard it. "This," she said evenly, "was never about public safety." Her eyes moved slowly across the room. It was about perception. You saw a black woman beside an expensive vehicle and decided the story before you checked the facts. Nobody argued. Captain Ellis finally looked directly at Rowe and the others. "Effective immediately, all 4 officers are suspended pending full review." The words landed heavily inside the room. Collins closed his eyes briefly. Pike stared at the floor. Officer Harlan looked completely hollow now, stripped of the confidence he carried in the plaza earlier that afternoon. Naomi did not smile. Victory was never the point. She turned toward the glowing monitors one last time, looking at the endless rows of names and complaints stretching across the system her company helped build. "I did not come here for revenge," she said quietly. I came here because accountability should not depend on who the victim turns out to be. Even the dispatchers behind the glass had stopped pretending not to listen. Naomi picked up her portfolio and walked toward the exit beside Captain Ellis. Just before reaching the hallway, she stopped and looked back once more at the room full of uniforms. You thought authority came from a badge, she said softly. But real authority comes from restraint, truth, and the ability to see people clearly before you judge them. Then she walked out of the precinct without raising her voice once, leaving behind a silence so heavy that every person inside that building understood the same thing at exactly the same moment. Naomi Bennett had not just exposed 4 officers that day. She had exposed an entire system that forgot the difference between suspicion and prejudice.